I'm so grateful to be here tonight. What a special night. It's raining in Waimea again. Hallelujah. Here in Nani, Waimea, even when it's in drought, is gorgeous and beautifully kept. And at the same time, I did want to be able to turn on the faucet and get running water. And I was a little getting concerned about that because we have had a tremendous drought problem. What I have learned are so many things by being in Hawaii. When we moved out here, we first moved to Waikiki. We were up at 4,100 feet in elevation. That was a whole learning process right there. And one of the things I learned about Hawaii is that you're not only who you are by where your people come from, whether you're indigenous, whether you're Asian, whether you're European, all of the different varieties in those titles, but you're also who you are by where you live, what elevation you're at. I got to, and Rodi did too, we got to learn a little bit about the Paniolo culture by living upcountry. We got to learn about the upcountry people who are so fiercely independent and yet who pull together so well when there is time of need. It's really remarkable. But after about 12 years, we found this beautiful spot in North Kohala. And if you haven't been to a place called Niuli'i, I'll quickly let you know that it is almost at the very end of the coastal road. It's about a mile before it ends in the Pololu Overlook and Valley. And we found a beautiful piece of property there that we lived in. But I never had lived off of catchment. That was a whole, so talk about rooting for the rain. And wondering whether you were going to be able to take that shower or turn on the spigot. But we always had a really good time there and always had the resources that we needed. One of the things that I learned, and I learned a lot by trial and error, and probably more error than I was entitled to. One of the things that I learned when we were there was how quickly you could go from having 3 sheep to 47. I had no idea what I was doing, and that you need to trade out the rams because otherwise you wind up with a lot of cross-eyed sheep, and you don't want that. I also found out that you should not name your sheep. A food source you shouldn't become close to. Every once in a while, a mama sheep would push away a baby and reject it. And that little lamb would come looking at you and buying, and I'm not saying it, buying. And I had this bottle with a thing of colostrum, which I would mix up, and I'd have to hold that little baby lamb in my lap and have it feed off this bottle. And I learned that lamb can't stay here. I have to give that one away because sheep are not pets. They do not get housebroken. They do not come when you call. They are very, very independent, and they are a domesticated animal for food source. So I learned to do something I never imagined. I grew up a suburban kid outside of a big city. I learned how to slaughter, field dress, and butcher. It was a big deal. But I also thought that food does not come on a styrofoam tray, just as water doesn't come just out of the spigot. So I needed to learn how to do those things, to be really a part of the land and to be a part of the North Kohala experience. So I did do that. I also learned a bit about farming, and that's basically what I'd like to talk to you about tonight is I began by planting some orange and grapefruit trees. First of all, because I was scared of farming, and I knew that grapefruit and orange trees were familiar to me because I had lived in Louisiana, and they're grown there, and I even had some in my yard. But soon I decided that it would be more adventurous and probably more gratifying to plant some exotic trees, things that were either indigenous or similar to that in the, in the tropics and in Hawaii specifically. So unsure of what to select, I consulted a fellow whose gardening prowess was well known in the area, and he suggested breadfruit. Ta-da. That's what by the way, I dressed for radio. Smart of me, huh? Anyway, I am wearing a breadfruit pattern shirt. So he suggested breadfruit, and he suggested it for lots of reasons, some of which were that it was a beautiful tree. It had a handsome fullness. It also grew very quickly, so you got gratification right away. You got to watch it grow. He spoke of the fruit being edible at any stage of development, which was great. A food source that, before the introduction of Western diets, had been a staple throughout the tropics. That it was highly prized for its wealth of vitamins and minerals and calories. He told me that planting breadfruit, ulu, would make a contribution to food sustainability on our island, and that I could be serving as a hedge against our precarious food supply here in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So what he said made sense to me, and I said, sure, yes, I'll do that. I will plant breadfruit, and I'd be proud to nourish and sustain our island community, especially if the need arises, because we are all by ourselves. Well, weeks later, Tom drove his truck to our house with 12 of the most exquisite-looking little trees. You don't think of saplings as cute, but these were. With sculpted leaves and just about, I don't know, maybe about 2 feet high. And that afternoon, I had great fun running from one spot to the next, spreading my arms, pretending to be a tree, and contemplating the effects of planting one tree here, one tree there. Would they frame our view? Would they give us more privacy? Would they be vulnerable to the strong winds and rain that often battered that part of the island? Well, once all 12 were sighted, Tom looked at me and said, okay, now start digging. I said, I have a tractor with an auger. I can just drill a hole in about a minute. And he said, yeah, but they glaze the soil. And it's hard for tender young roots to penetrate the glaze of the dirt. So you need to dig out the holes yourself. Pardon me, that was quite a learning process. And by the time I had planted all 12 saplings, I was very, very proud. I had a great deal of satisfaction and one incredibly sore back, neck, and shoulders. A few weeks later, a friend of mine who had grown up on the islands came over to our property, and I walked her through and showed her all the ulu that we had planted throughout the yard. Well, she looked impressed, and walking from one to the next, she looked at me sort of cagily and said, you're going to have plenty ulu. And I said, really? Oh, that's great. And she said, no, I mean really a lot. She explained to me that each breadfruit tree could produce more than 300 pounds of ulu in a single season, and I had 12 trees. I was not only alarmed, I was terrified. There's a responsibility when you're growing food, not to let it go to waste. So I would have to harvest this stuff and find out a way to do it, and I wasn't about to have a little Kool-Aid stand on the highway with my ulu, saying $1.50 each or whatever. So I was a little annoyed with Tom. He must have known how much breadfruit I would be cultivating, although he gave me no indication. He had just enlisted, and he hadn't just enlisted me to be a hedge against hunger. I was the hedge. And I told myself, okay, calm down, take a deep breath. It would be years before I would get that much fruit. And there's nothing wrong with having a whole lot. It'll make great treats to share with friends. Well, then I thought about folks in Louisiana who had planted way too much zucchini and how they used to stack mounds at the desks of coworkers when they were at lunch. And how neighbors would lock their cars, not to prevent theft, but to prevent bushels of zucchini being dropped into the back seats of their parked cars after they refused to accept any more as outright gifts. Well, in amazement, I got to watch, and concern, by the way, I got to watch all 12 trees survive and climb to the sky practically overnight. Felt like watching Jack and the Beanstalk. It wasn't long before those small bumpy knobs sprouted at the end of the tree's many branches, and these knobs quickly went from looking like bright green ping pong balls to fruit that took 2 hands to cradle. And although I knew these were the promised edible fruit, nothing about them looked the slightest bit appetizing to me. They had a leathery outer skin and segmented bumps that gave them the appearance of oversized hand grenades. Since Tom had said the breadfruit could be eaten at any stage of its development, I didn't worry about what constituted ripeness and figured I'd go out, harvest one, and try it. The fruit I selected was attached to the tree by a soft, pliable stem, which I was able to cut easily with pruning shears. And when I did, I watched the large, heavy fruit hit the ground with a thud, having passed right through my fingers. As my eyes followed it roll across the grass, I felt something tapping me on my left shoulder. It was white sap oozing from the cut stem of the tree. I tried to wipe the sap away, but immediately realized that this was no ordinary tree sap. It was a latex-like goo, sticky enough to bind my fingers together and make releasing the pruning shear handles a challenge. Well, washing the goo off my hands was no easy task either. Soap, hot water, and vigorous scrubbing had almost no effect. I later learned that the sap from breadfruit trees was used as a glue for Hawaiian canoes. It was not only adhesive, it was waterproof. Well, finally, I found I could rub it off, like rubber cement, after it dried, though it required considerably more friction. Well, somewhat daunted, I brought the big dinosaur egg of a fruit into the kitchen and placed it on a cutting board. I took my sharpest long knife and pierced the skin. Darn if more sap didn't start to flow. The fruit itself held a lot of sap. Cutting that fouled the cutting board and rendered the knife useless as it stuck inside the fruit rather than sliced through it. So it looked like the sword and the stone. There it was. Well, knowing that I would soon have tons of these, I restrained my learn-by-doing impulses and went to my computer. The most frequently cited solution was to oil one's hands and the knives before cutting or handling the fruit. Well, that only proved modestly successful. A greasy, slippery knife isn't the best or most reliable kitchen tool I'd ever held. Eventually, I stumbled upon a recipe that called for baking the ulu before cutting into it, as was done in emus when roasting pigs. I returned outside, harvested another breadfruit, and placed it unpeeled in a hot oven and cooked it for well over an hour. As it baked, a pleasant, sweet fragrance filled the house. After removing it from the oven and letting it cool, I was able to pare away the outer skin and cut the fruit with no muss, no fuss, and no goo. But the pale, spongy inside did not match the appeal of its aroma. And when I tasted a chunk, its dry, fibrous texture was odd and tough to swallow. It was unpleasant to me. So I chopped up the remaining fruit, dropped it into a food processor along with half a stick of butter, and began pouring in milk as the blade spun. I started thinking of twice-baked potatoes and folded in some cheddar cheese and turned the whole mass into a casserole dish and baked it again for another 30 minutes. Assuming that butter, milk, and cheese could make cardboard taste okay, I was ready to give it a try. It was better than okay. It was delicious. Since then, I've made ulu puddings and pies and muffins, as well as that casserole and a few other items as well. And I serve breadfruit to family, guests, and visitors, and wait for them to ask if they can have one or two breadfruit to take home with them. When they do, and they usually do, I just smile, thinking, did you lock your car? Thank you. I'm Alan from Waimea. I now live in Waimea and not in North Kohala, but I have very fond memories.
Mahalo. Thank you so much.